Weeks after the fire, a crew waded into a creek that looked dead. Ash coated the water gray. The trees stood black and bare. Nearly 2,800 acres had burned, and the native trout that once held in these pools were gone or dying. So the crew did something that looked almost insulting to the scale of the damage. They started pounding wooden posts into the mud by hand and weaving willow branches between them. No excavators, no concrete, no hatchery trucks, just sticks. It looked like a beaver's abandoned craft project. And then the fish came back. Let me show you what that creek actually looked like, because the pictures are hard to forget. Picture a narrow channel cut deep into the ground, like a trench. The banks are bare. The water runs fast and shallow over a bed of loose stone. After the fire, every rain washed a slug of black ash and grit off the burned hillside straight into that trench. There was nowhere for the water to slow down, nowhere for it to spread out, nowhere for a fish to hide from the heat or the mud. The creek was basically a drain pipe with the tap left running. And here is the first thing almost everyone got wrong. They looked at that creek and thought the fire had done this. The fire, they figured, was the disaster. Fix the fire damage and you fix the creek. But the fire wasn't the real problem. The fire just pulled back a curtain. That creek had been broken for more than 100 years before a single flame touched it. It only looked normal because nobody alive remembered it any other way. Here's what I mean. Go back far enough, and this stream didn't run in a straight, fast trench. It sprawled, it had ponds, it had wet meadows on either side, soft ground that stayed green into late summer. It had deep, cold, shaded pools where trout could sit out a heat wave. And the reason it had all of that comes down to one animal that had been almost entirely erased from the West. Beavers. Before the fur trade, beavers were everywhere in these drainages. Millions of them. They built dams, the dams backed up water, the ponds spread that water sideways into the soil, and the whole valley floor acted like a sponge. Trappers spent the better part of the 1800s pulling those animals out for their pelts. And when the beavers vanished, their dams rotted and blew out. The ponds drained. The water that used to spread across the valley now had one job: leave as fast as possible. So the creek cut down into its own bed. Engineers call it incision. Forget the word. Picture a stream slowly sawing a canyon into the ground, dropping lower and lower until it disconnects from the flat land it used to flood. The meadows dried, the pools filled in, the shade disappeared. The creek did not need more rain. It needed a way to stop losing the rain it already had. That's the reversal that changes the whole story. The problem was never that nature failed here. The problem was that one of its workers had been removed and the system had been quietly falling apart ever since. People just grew up looking at the wreckage and calling it a creek. Now drop a wildfire on top of that. In a healthy, sponge-like valley, a fire on the hills is survivable for the fish. The wet meadows and deep ponds stay cool. The mud gets caught before it buries anything. There's a refuge. But this creek had no refuge left. So when the burned slopes started shedding ash and sediment, the trout had nowhere to go. Warm, shallow water, choking grit. A straight channel that flushed everything downstream in one violent pulse. This is how a fire finishes off a fish population that was already living on the edge. So what do? The obvious answer is the one most people would reach for. Leave it alone and let nature heal. Or truck in hatchery fish and restock once the water clears. Both of those fail here, and it's worth understanding why, because the failure is the whole point. Leaving it alone doesn't work because there's nothing left to heal back to. A degraded trench doesn't spontaneously become a wet meadow. It just keeps being a trench, flushing ash for years. And restocking fish into a creek with no deep cold pools is like releasing them into a hot, muddy gutter. You're not saving them, you're feeding them to the next heat wave. That's the trap, and it's crueler than it looks. To bring back the trout, you need slow, cool, deep water. To get slow water, you need something to hold it back. The thing that used to hold it back was a beaver dam, and beavers won't move into a creek like this because there's no deep water for them to feel safe in, and they can't build a proper dam in a channel that's already cut too deep and running too fast. So you need beavers to make ponds, and you need ponds to get beavers. Round and round. That's the loop nobody could break. For a long time, that loop looked unbreakable. And this is where the story turns, because a group of restoration scientists asked a different question. Not, how do we rebuild this whole ecosystem? That's impossibly expensive. The question was smaller and smarter. What is the one missing condition? And can we fake it just long enough for nature to take the job back? The missing condition was slow water, so they decided to build the crudest possible imitation of a beaver dam. Wooden posts pounded into the stream bed in a line across the channel. Willow and branches woven between the posts, leaky, low, ugly. In the trade, they're called beaver dam analogs, but forget the jargon. They're speed bumps for a creek. That's it. And I know exactly what you're thinking, because everyone thought it. Sticks? In a creek that just flushed an entire fish population downstream? The next big flow is going to rip those posts out and scatter them across 3 counties. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Here's the mechanism, and once you see it, the whole thing stops looking ridiculous. Water hits the leaky dam and slows down. Slow water can't carry as much sediment, so it drops its load of sand and gravel just upstream of the structure, building the bed back up. Some water pushes over the top and digs a deep plunge pool on the downstream side. Some water shoves sideways out of the trench, back onto the old floodplain, soaking into the ground. That soaked-in water doesn't evaporate. It seeps back into the creek slowly, for weeks, cold, long after the rain has stopped. One ugly little structure does 4 things at once. It builds up the bed, it digs a deep, cold pool, it re-wets the meadow, and it catches the woody debris that becomes hiding cover for fish. The crew was not trying to rebuild the creek. They were trying to hire back the animal they'd fired and do its first day of work for it. Now, the doubts. Real ones, not straw men. Wouldn't slow, ponded water get too warm and cook the trout? It's the opposite. Fast, shallow water sitting on hot rock is what warms up. Deep pools and water forced down into the cool ground come back colder than the surface flow. The ponds are the refuge from heat, not the cause of it. Wouldn't a dam across the creek block the fish from moving? These structures are deliberately leaky and low. Water spills through and over them. Fish move around and past them the same way they move past real beaver dams, which they've done for as long as there have been beavers and fish, which is a very long time. And wouldn't the floods just destroy them? This is the best part. The first real high flow came through, and the structures did get partly buried. Sediment piled up against them. To an outsider, it looked like they'd failed and choked with mud. But getting buried in sediment was the entire point. That's not the structure breaking, that's the structure working. Every load of trapped gravel and sand was the creek bed rebuilding itself, climbing back up toward the floodplain it had abandoned a century ago. The thing that looked like failure was the mechanism. Then the pools deepened, then they held, and then they held again through the next flow and the one after that. And slowly, the creek stopped looking like a drainpipe and started looking like a place a fish could live. This is where nature quietly takes the story away from the humans. Once the first pools were deep and stable, the trout came back into the treated stretches. Not because anyone stocked them, but because there was finally cold, deep, hidden water to hold in. Insects returned to the slow margins. Sediment sorted into clean gravel where fish spawn. Green came back along the wet edges. The crew had built maybe a first draft. The creek finished the manuscript itself. You want to know how convincing this really is? Then you have to leave this one park and look at the place that turned a hunch into hard proof. Bridge Creek in Central Oregon. Steelhead country, a threatened fish, a stream cut into the same kind of degraded trench. Starting around 2009, researchers installed a large network of these same beaver dam analogs on the order of 100 or more structures, and then they did something most restoration projects never bother with. They monitored it for years against untreated stretches, and they published the results. The findings landed in the journal Scientific Reports in 2016, led by researcher Nick Bowes and colleagues, and the numbers were not small. In the treated reaches, the production of young steelhead rose dramatically compared to the untreated sections. The habitat got deeper and more complex. And here's the kicker that turned skeptics. The beavers themselves moved in and started building on top of and around the human-made structures, taking over the maintenance. The scientists had given nature a head start, and nature clocked in and kept working. That's the difference between a hopeful story and a documented one. Somebody counted. Somebody compared treated water to untreated water. Somebody watched the wild animals show up and take the job. If it's this cheap and this effective, why did nobody do it sooner? Two reasons. First, for most of the last century, beavers were seen strictly as pests, animals that flooded roads and plugged culverts, something to be removed, not invited. Second, restoration meant heavy machinery and big budgets, so a line of hand-pounded posts looked unserious. It didn't look like real engineering, it looked like a craft project. The idea had to survive being laughed at before it could be measured. And then came the part nobody had promised. Because once these beaver ponds and rewetted meadows exist, they do something extra that has nothing to do with fish. They resist fire. A researcher named Emily Fairfax mapped this across wildfires in the western United States in work published with Andrew Whittle in 2020. She compared riparian areas with beavers to those without, and the pattern was stark. When wildfire swept through, the beaver dam stretches stayed green. Ribbons of living, wet vegetation in the middle of a black burn scar. The ponds and soaked ground simply would not carry fire the way dry land did. Fairfax has described these beaver complexes as landscapes that are, in effect, fireproofed by the animals themselves. Sit with what that means for a creek recovering from a fire. The very structures built to bring the trout back are also building the thing that protects the next generation of trout from the next fire. A wet, spongy, beaver-worked valley becomes a refuge, a green island where fish and everything else can ride out the flames that turn the surrounding hills to ash. The tool for recovering from the disaster is also the shield against the disaster. That's the twist that makes this bigger than one creek. Now let me be honest with you, because a story that promises miracles is a story you shouldn't trust. This does not work everywhere. Pound posts into the wrong stream and you get nothing, or worse. It needs the right kind of channel. One with a gentle enough gradient that water will actually pond instead of just blasting through. It needs a nearby supply of willow and wood, either for the structures or for real beavers to eat and build with. It needs water in the first place. It needs land where a re-wetted floodplain won't drown a road or a house, which means it needs landowners and agencies who agree to let a stretch of ground get wet and messy again. Put a structure in a steep, flashy canyon, and it can blow out or send water somewhere you didn't want it. Placement is everything. This was never magic, it was leverage. The intervention was tiny, but it was aimed at the exact load-bearing point of a broken system. Hit the bottleneck, and a few days of work with posts and branches unlocks a process that then runs on its own for years. Miss the bottleneck, and you've built a fence in a river. That's actually why the story is believable. The people doing this will tell you where it fails. They'll tell you it's a technique, not a savior, and a technique that admits its limits is worth 100 silver bullets that don't. So come back to that burned creek, the one that looked dead, coated in ash, with a crew standing knee-deep in it, holding wooden posts, looking like they'd brought a slingshot to a wildfire. They had not lost their minds. They had understood something the rest of us missed. The fire didn't kill that creek. The fire just exposed a wound that had been open for 100 years, ever since the water lost the one worker that knew how to slow it down. Every expensive instinct we have, the machines, the concrete, the hatchery trucks, was aimed at the symptom. The creek had been quietly pointing at the missing animal the whole time. They didn't out-engineer the fire, they didn't build a new creek, they undid a century of teaching that water to run away too fast, and then they stepped back and let it slow down. The trout didn't return because people overpowered a burned landscape. They returned because someone finally rebuilt the one thing the beavers used to build for free and then got out of the way. There are more stories like this than you'd think, where the cheapest, strangest-looking answer turned out to be the one everyone had been trained to ignore. The most powerful machine in that whole valley was never going to be a machine. It has fur, it works for free, and we spent 100 years trying to get rid of it. We didn't fix the creek, we just stopped blocking the part of it that already knew what to do.